Good morning to everyone and welcome to this June FTA Brexit webinar on Brexit, the latest developments. So I'm Pauline Bastidon, I'm Head of European Policy at FTA, and I will be joined later by my colleague Sarah Lawadi, who is European Policy Manager and in charge of our European road freight members. In terms of what we will cover during this particular webinar, we are going to give you a bit of an update on the status of negotiations, the progress made on some topics and the lack of progress made on other topics, as well as what to expect in terms of the developments for the Council next week and more generally next steps. We will then present the FTA Brexit priorities for UK trade and logistics, which is basically an expanded version of our Keep It on Trading agenda, agreed at the UK Council in January. The report was released yesterday on the occasion of our Brexit conference, second edition of Keep It on Trading. So we will present to you the key parts of that report. We are also going to give you a bit of an update on the withdrawal and the haulage bills, as well as the recent consultation of the FT on the secondary legislation to the haulage bill. We'll give you a bit of an overview of the recent FTA engagement and activities, as well as new services we're launching, and then briefly sum up how you can prepare for Brexit. So before we really start with the content, as usual, a bit of house rules for the webinar. Please keep your microphone and telephone muted. We'll remind you that the webinar will be recorded, and as always, a few days later, the recording will be made available on the FTA website. I'm afraid we're not going to be able to deal with any technical issues you're experiencing during the webinar, but of course, we can always go back to the recording, which should be made available probably early next week. If you have any questions, you can use the chat box throughout the webinar. And of course, if there's no time or you have some questions that you think of later, you're more than welcome to contact us. And my email address will be available towards the end of the slide deck. So first of all, a little bit of an update on where we are with negotiations. So you might have seen that there was a joint statement between the EU and the UK that was made on the 19th of June, so 2 days ago. And it's fair to say that there has been some progress on parts of the withdrawal agreement. And it's now, in terms of content, pretty much 80% agreed. However, the points that have been agreed were not really contentious points. It was more a question of time, I guess, for the two sides to come to some kind of agreement. And the real sort of stopping point, what's really preventing the withdrawal agreement from being finalized, is the issue of the Irish border. And we've not really seen any significant progress in the last weeks on the issue of the Irish border. So this is still very much pending, and I'll go into more details on this in a few minutes. In parallel, the talks on the future relationship are ongoing, and a couple of weeks ago, they started discussing transport, more specifically aviation and road haulage, market access possibilities for international transport and for cabotage. As well as other parameters that are very important, such as aviation security and for road haulage recognition of qualifications and the issue of the driver licenses. Some slides were presented by the UK government on that occasion. Those of you who attended our Keep It On conference yesterday will have seen most of these slides, in fact, in the presentation from DFT. And we understand that at this stage it was more a case of the UK presenting their negotiating stance, what will eventually be in the white paper on Brexit that we're all expecting. But there wasn't really a detailed discussion at this stage. So they are probably going to come back to transport as well as other topics in the coming weeks. But I guess that the goodwill on this also depends on progress with the Withdrawal Agreement and the Irish Protocol. So next week, on the 29th of June, there will be the EU Council, and the member states without the UK are going to meet to sort of try and take stock of progress and decide what kind of message they want to send to the UK. Of course, for the rest of the talks, don't brace yourself for any significant milestones or progress at this stage. We've been told by both sides that they were not really expecting any significant progress, in fact. So the prospect of no deal really remains on the table in spite of the recent progress on the Withdrawal agreements. And the next deadline is the October Council on the 18th and 19th of October, which has been identified by the EU side as the absolute deadline to agree the Withdrawal agreement, at least the content of the text, that it may then go to both the European Parliament and the UK Parliament, and also be ratified by all member states and the UK. So in terms of where we are in the process of negotiations, even though there has been some progress on certain issues, as I mentioned, all in all, it's still relatively limited. This slide hasn't really changed that much, unfortunately, since last month, and in fact, since the March Council. The Withdrawal agreement is still not finalized. We're still waiting for some kind of agreement on Ireland. That matters because the EU motto is that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So if there's no progress on Ireland, we're not really anywhere further in terms of the withdrawal arrangements being agreed, and the transition, which is of course part of it, is not a certainty. So it means that if there's no agreement on Ireland, we're still without a transition, even though there has been a political agreement on it. In terms of the framework for the future relationship, as I said, preparatory discussions have started, and transport was a good example. You will have heard and seen in the press, I'm sure, further points about things like security and Galileo. So, I mean, these topics have taken precedence over customs, trade, and that kind of things, primarily because the UK has not finalized its own position on these topics. As I've stated previously, the best we can hope for eventually will be a political declaration on the future relationship that will accompany the withdrawal arrangements, and the comprehensive free trade agreements and discussions with the EU will really take place after Brexit. So in terms of the withdrawal agreements, as I said, there has been some progress, albeit limited, on parts of the withdrawal agreement. So the parts where there is consensus relate to things like exchange of information between authorities, and for instance, notified bodies that regulate conformity with EU rules. There has been some agreement on continued access to EU databases as well for UK authorities. So for instance, provisions related to ongoing administrative cooperation in customs and so on, access to NCTS, which is a database for transit procedures, that sort of things. There's been also some agreement on the timelines for ongoing VAT procedures, and validity of ongoing customs procedures. And for instance, the agreement relates really to VAT covering goods in transit or being dispatched at the end of the transition period, assuming there is one. And it would give a bit more leeway for companies to apply for VAT refunds until the 31st of March 2021, and to amend VAT returns until the end of 2021. There have been some agreements as well on the validity period of some ongoing customs special procedures, and I'll be able to give more details later if there are any questions on that. All of this will be detailed in our Brexit Digest on Monday, of course. There are other parts on which progress is ongoing, but that require more work, including the protection of data processed before the end of the transition or implementation period, issues related to geographical indications. So, for instance, the protection that comes with, I don't know, the name Scottish whiskey, for instance, that sort of things. On the treatment of ongoing police and judicial cooperation in criminal matters and things related to cooperation there, and on consistent application and interpretation of the agreement by both the Union and the UK, and dispute settlement, what is commonly known as governance. So all of these points are still pending and there's no agreement, but the real showstopper is going to be the Irish border. And in this respect, you will remember that in December, there had been an agreement identifying 3 options that was agreed by both sides. Solutions through the EU-UK relationship, other solutions, so for instance, facilitation through technology, and a backstop option. The backstop option was supposed to be a sort of emergency option that would be valid no matter what, wouldn't really enter into force or be used if something else could be found, another solution, either through the wider relationship or through technology. But if that proved impossible, at least the backstop would be there to make sure that no matter what, as long as the withdrawal agreement got ratified, there wouldn't be a hard border on the island of Ireland. This is really important because effectively, if this is not agreed, if this backstop is not agreed, there will not be a withdrawal agreement, and without a withdrawal agreement, there will not be a transition. So the EU had proposed a backstop option whereby essentially Northern Ireland would remain part of the customs union and the common regulatory area. EU VAT and excise rules would apply to Northern Ireland, and checks would be performed on goods arriving at ports and airports from the rest of the world, of course, as well as Great Britain in this case. For obvious reasons, this EU option was rejected by Theresa May, was repeated several times that it wouldn't be acceptable because you would then need to have checks performed between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. So the UK then decided to present its own proposal for a backstop. The proposal, though, only relates to customs issues, so it's a bit more limited in scope, and the UK government has admitted it. There's a reference to a future proposal on regulatory alignment as well, which has not yet been published. And the EU looked at it and explained that they would judge it according to 3 tests. Is it a workable solution to avoid a hard border? Does it respect the integrity of the single market and the customs union? And is it an all-weather backstop? So can we rely on it no matter what, if nothing better is on offer? And unfortunately, the proposal has failed to pass the 3 tests, according to the EU27 side. So as far as the first question goes, is it a workable solution? They've pointed out that regulatory issues were not covered, which the UK government readily admitted. The UK backstop only covers customs. However, the important thing to note is that around 75% of border checks are not customs related. So just having a customs related backstop did not really help to ensure in itself that there wouldn't be any checks between Northern Ireland and the Republic. The question as to who will be competent to carry out the probably mainly documentary customs checks, who will collect duties, what the implications of a UK-wide backstop would mean for the free trade agreement that the EU has concluded with third countries, all of these were questions that were raised as well by the European side. When it comes to the integrity of the single market and customs union and whether that proposal from the UK respected it, the EU felt that the proposal to only abide by some elements of the common commercial policy would raise many questions as to whether this would include things like preferential rules of origin, tariff rate quotas, tariff suspensions, trade defense measures, and allocation of customs revenue. They fear that there could be some kind of a gap or misalignment of commercial policy between the EU and the UK. And the proposal for the UK to remain covered by EU free trade agreements after the transition until the UK had its own free trade agreements with the rest of the world that entered into force has also been received with great skepticism from the European side, as EU27 are worried that this would force them to renegotiate agreements with third countries. There doesn't seem to be a lot of good political will actually on that one. And last but not least, is this an all-weather backstop? Is this something that can always be used and relied upon? That has been probably the most difficult point, especially for Dublin, especially for the Republic of Ireland. The fact that it's implied in the proposal that the backstop would only be temporary. There's an indicative timeline of end of 2021, so 1 year after the end of the transition period. But Dublin's and Brussels' view is that it needs to apply as long as a better solution is not up and running. So their verdict was that this is not good enough. So as a result, both sides have told us, both privately and publicly, that no significant progress is expected next week at the European Council. In fact, we've heard from the European side that EU27 leaders intend to issue a warning to the UK that they really need to see more progress in time for the October Council, which then becomes the next deadline. But Leo Varadkar from the Republic of Ireland explained he was concerned by that because the UK will not technically be in the room in October when this is discussed. And so there would need to be an agreement before for it to be sort of validated politically at the October Council. So we can probably expect more meetings between the two sides and more discussions over the summer. And we're also preparing ourselves for the possibility that this could not be agreed in time, and that unfortunately we might not get the clarity we need regarding the transition before much later in the year, which of course would force companies to take matters into their own hands and decide whether they think they can rely on it or not. So what happens next? Well, of course, we have the European Council, Article 50, so without the UK. Then early July, the Cabinet will have to agree their preferred customs model, which will lead then to the publication of the much awaited and delayed UK White Paper. This, according to Robin Walker MP, who's Minister at DEXEU, who was speaking at our conference yesterday, is going to be the biggest Brexit-related document published pretty much since the referendum. So this is going to summarize all of the negotiating objectives of the UK in all the various areas, from transport to data to customs, sanitary matters, and beyond, of course. So we're eagerly awaiting this, and so is the EU. At the same time, the customs and trade bills will return to the House of Commons to be discussed. But the real test, and it might not actually come during that week specifically, is the reaction from the EU to the UK White Paper. Because if it's dismissed, if they reject it or they refuse to engage, it really doesn't look very good for the rest of the negotiations. And all of this, of course, that there's an additional time pressure, which is that the House of Commons is going to be in recess fairly soon, in about a month's time. So that leaves us then with the next European Council. Will there be a draft agreement at that point? That has always been the intention of Michel Barnier. He was very clear from the beginning that this was the EU internal deadline, because there will be time needed to then ratify the agreement. And it would also be good to offer more clarity to industry before the 29th of March 2019. But unfortunately, we're hearing noises that this might be a bit ambitious, and there might need to be further meetings taking place later in October, in November, and even possibly in December, which of course would be catastrophic for industry, because we all need the clarity, really. So if all goes well, and we go back to the optimistic scenario, then the House of Commons and European Parliament should approve the Withdrawal Agreement. It should then be validated by both the UK government and the Council at a qualified majority, meaning that in principle no member state could veto it on its own, although Ireland, of course, will have a very decisive vote. And then, of course, the UK will leave the EU on the 29th of March 2019. So what you can expect is hopefully a draft withdrawal agreement in October. Unfortunately, it could be postponed, but at least we can see what the text looks like on some of the issues, some of the parameters. But I would remind you that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So from that point of view, we're not even sure we can rely on the transition period at this stage. Then hopefully there will be a legally binding withdrawal agreement with a protocol on Ireland, as well as a political agreement on the framework for the future relationship in March. Then hopefully a transition period if the withdrawal agreement is ratified. And then in the future, a new comprehensive set of agreements. There is always a solution that could be available potentially, at least in theory, if we are facing no deal, or it's getting very tight, or the withdrawal agreement is not ratified, which is to extend the discussions under Article 50. But that would require the UK to explicitly ask for it, and then all the member states to agree at unanimity. So politically, it might be a bit tricky, but it's an emergency solution potentially. So I'll now move on to the FTA priorities, what we presented yesterday, in fact. So it's, as I say, an elaboration on the points that were agreed by the Council in January, and that were then presented to the Prime Minister in a letter. So we're really asking for clarity very urgently on the transition and implementation period. We need to make sure this is a certainty and not just a political promise. There's a section on customs, which reuses, in fact, most of the elements we had in our previous customs publication, but we asked the UK to negotiate a waiver for security and safety requirements, like Norway or Switzerland, for instance, to ratify the Common Trade Convention, and get an agreement of mutual recognition for the AEO status, among other things. We are also asking government, as well as the EU and other governments, to look at other border checks and measures that could be negotiated, so that we don't need to have all the sanitary, phytosanitary, or import control type of checks at the border. There's a section, of course, on road transport market access, where we're asking for, as much as possible, the status quo to continue in terms of international transport in particular, with the recognition of the operator license across the borders, and for a period of 5 years, as is the case today. we have a section on driver licenses and qualifications where we want to see complete mutual recognition between the EU and the UK. A section on type approval to make sure that the vans, for instance, that are type approved in the UK can then be used also in Ireland and other European countries. Section on access for aviation and for rail as well. And of course, a very important section on skills where we are asking for the political agreement of December to be translated into concrete actions as soon as possible, and also to find a solution not just for the permanent, not just for the EU workers who are permanent residents in the UK, but also the ones who come to the UK only around peak times to provide support at specific times of the year, for instance, ahead of Christmas. And there will be an important table there, and it's just a very, very rough estimate of all the things that need to be factored in, but it will give you a useful reminder that borders, controls, and trade procedures are about much more than customs and a customs union. And obviously, all of these things need to be factored into your planning. So very quick update on the Withdrawal Bill. There was a final debate in the House of Commons that took place yesterday. The House of Commons accepted most of the Lords' proposed amendments, except for the so-called meaningful vote amendment. So essentially, the decision as to whether the House of Commons vote on the withdrawal agreement, so the deal, if you want the Brexit deal, will be sort of take it or leave it type of agreement, or whether they'll be able to decide what the next course of action should be, will rest upon the Speaker of the House. The bill is now awaiting royal assent. It returned to the House of Lords, where the revised amendment was accepted. And we don't have a date yet for the royal assent, but it should not take place in too distant a future. We'll give you, of course, a more detailed update on this once royal assent has been given to the bill. But as a reminder, it's really there to make sure that EU law becomes UK law, and that there is some kind of continuity from a regulatory perspective between the pre-Brexit and the post-Brexit world in the UK. So I'm now going to hand over to Sarah to tell you more about road transport.
Thank you, Pauline. Let me start with a reminder on road transport market access. The default situation in this area is that the community license, a community license issued by the UK, would no longer be valid in the EU 27 after Brexit. So that's why alternative arrangements must be found as part of Brexit negotiations to find a replacement solution to the community license. Before updating you on transport negotiations themselves, I'd like to say a few words on what the UK is doing in terms of contingency to be prepared for any outcome when it comes to road transport market access. Those of you who've been following the previous webinars already know that I'm going to talk about the road haulage bill, which actually is a contingency to address the worst case scenario if there is no agreement on transport or no agreement at all, in order to give the Department for Transport the powers to run a permit system, should such a permit system be needed. The bill is a framework legislation, a piece of legislation providing a framework, and it will be complemented with secondary legislation that will define criteria if the prospect of permits and quotas for permits materializes. The Department for Transport launched a consultation to prepare this upcoming piece of secondary legislation. And in this consultation, the FTA asked for feedback on a set of potential criteria, such as the size of the operator, how much cross-border business an operator does, be it in volume or in proportion to their total activity, or the type of goods, etc. We consulted our members on these potential criteria. I would like to thank those of you who provided input. And we came to the conclusion that none of these criteria would work, and that any permit scheme would cause heavy disruptions. In our submission to the consultation, we therefore refused to endorse any of the suggested criteria, apart from maybe operator repute, which is already part of the current operator license. In the submission, we also highlighted the objectives that we can't compromise on, taking into account both the interests of the haulage industry and of the broader economy. So we really highlighted that UK haulers must not be denied the right to operate in the EU. We also stressed that shippers and freight buyers must retain access to a variety of affordable transport options and a variety of operators. And we highlighted how crucial this is for integrated just-in-time supply chains that are heavily reliant on roll and roll of traffic. So the point was really to show that road transport must be dealt with seriously because it has a tremendous impact on the whole economy. We also said that reliability over several years is needed because neither operators nor their customers can afford the uncertainty about an ongoing logistics contract. For example, if an operator were denied permit renewal after a year. So that's what we expressed and pressed in our submission in a nutshell. This road haulage bill and this consultation are part of the government's contingency planning, as I said, but permits are not that preferred option. So before moving on to this preferred option, before updating you on that, just a quick reminder of the next steps of the contingency haulage bill. So it was introduced in February. The bill was introduced in February. It made its way in the House of Lords, with the final stage in the Lords completed in late March, and then it went to the House of Commons. This is still ongoing. The next steps in the House of Commons will be on the 25th of June. It will be a report stage, a stage in which MPs can make amendments, and the third reading will take place on the same day. The third reading, which will take place on the 25th of June, will be the final reading before the ping pong between the two chambers can start. A DFT official confirmed yesterday that they expected the bill to pass before the summer recess, which starts on the 20th of July. Overall, it is expected that the permit scheme could be operational by the end of this year, should it be needed. But as mentioned earlier, the government seeks a better solution that would make a permit system unnecessary. And this is what I'd like to update you about now. The infographic you see comes from the slides that the UK government presented earlier this month, and it outlines what the UK wants to achieve post-Brexit for road transport. So as you see, the UK would like to maintain liberalised access, including cross-trade and cabotage, which is very much in line with what FTA has been calling for. And the UK wants to achieve that through mutual recognition of operator licenses, registration documents, roadworthiness testing, and mutual recognition of certificates of professional competence. In return, the UK would like to continue to comply with EU rules for international transport, for instance, regarding driver's hours rules, which are actually already part of the AETR agreement. So it's actually already something the UK will have to comply with. So you see that the objective to maintain connectivity, to maintain liberalised access is shared on both sides, both for the EU27, as they mentioned in their formal position in the negotiating guidelines that were published a few months ago now. So the objectives are shared, but there will be a trade-off between the level of access and how much regulatory alignment the UK will accept. The EU27 and the UK will have to find the right balance as part of the negotiation, and whether the UK's offer to continue complying with EU rules for international transport, whether that will be deemed sufficient by the EU27 remains to be seen. So that's where we are now in a nutshell regarding road transport market access. We'll keep you posted on the future developments, but I will now give back the floor to Pauline to update you on FTA engagement.
So you will no doubt have seen from the press, and if you were present yesterday, you will certainly have heard it from the president of FTA, Lee Pomlet, sending very, very strong messages to government that time is running out, and the industry has been extremely patient, but now patience is really becoming a luxury we don't really have anymore. Nevertheless, we're still engaging with government at all levels, of course, still trying to engage in a constructive dialogue with them and share concrete proposals, but all the while reminding them that they need to bring additional clarity. So we've had in this period, of course, a number of bilateral meetings with the Department for Transport, with DEXEU, with HMRC regarding customs, the border delivery group. We continue to be part of these discussions, and also the UK permanent representation in Brussels, with individuals directly involved in the negotiations on the ground. There was also last week a meeting with Chris Grayling, the Secretary of State for Transport, where the priorities were shared once again, and the stance that we really need to get clarity now because we've waited long enough was also shared with him. And we've also briefed, of course, the opposition and backbenchers, as you would imagine, in particular regarding the passage of the haulage bill. We've also had quite a lot of engagement at European level, and we'll step that up again in the coming weeks, with a meeting last week with the Council Task Force. So this is the task force that helps prepare the meetings of the 27 remaining leaders of the EU when they discuss Brexit. The message was not a very positive or upbeat one, I have to say, and that's also guiding our reactions, because we don't see the likelihood of much progress coming in the coming days. We've had also meetings with French, Dutch, Belgian, and Irish authorities, in particular on issues related to borders and how they will be managed after Brexit. And obviously we'll continue to do that both through our network of sister associations as well as directly when this is possible. We took part and helped moderate a roundtable organized by IRU, the International Association of Road Transport, and permanent representations of the various member states in Brussels, where we discussed market access for road haulage, recognition of qualifications, and customs issues. Again, a bit of pushback from the other member states, hence the doubts regarding some of the negotiating objectives of the UK, but we'll keep trying, and we are relatively aligned with other trade associations in Europe on what we want, at least for road haulage. And of course, briefings to members of the European Parliament. So just a quick reminder in terms of what you got to do, that of course, at the moment, there are no changes. and there won't be any until at least the 29th of March 2019. But obviously, it doesn't mean that you can just stand still and do nothing. We really recommend that you start preparing. So how can you prepare and what can you do? Because it's fairly easy, I suppose, to tell you to prepare, but obviously you'll need a bit of guidance as to what exactly you're supposed to prepare for. And I have to admit that we're just as frustrated, if not more, by the lack of clarity. But in spite of that lack of clarity, there are still some steps you can take. So really urgently, if you have not done so already, assess your level of exposure, both direct and indirect. So you might have done that already for your company, but have you done it for your customers, for your suppliers, the suppliers of your suppliers, whom you might not actually know, and all your service providers from a transport and logistics perspective, including subcontractors when applicable. So you will not have full visibility on that yourselves necessarily, but by working with your supply chain and logistics partners, and if they do the same, of course, with theirs, hopefully you can get to the bottom of this and really map all the implications and level of exposure. And try to assess opportunities as well, if you can find some for your companies. Then this is really something you should already have done, but if you've not done it, I would really recommend that you take the time and effort to do this. It will not be wasted, no matter what the outcome. And then the second step is to really train and plan. So you can start developing contingency plans, very detailed ones. Try to review your options. So I mentioned yesterday, if you think you will need more stock, for instance, because you want to make sure that you're less vulnerable to potential border delays or disruptions, especially in the first few weeks after Brexit or after the end of the transition period. You need to understand exactly what that means in terms of timelines, whether you need to acquire some land or not, what about the building permits, what about all the customs procedures and things you need to apply for if you want, for instance, to be able to store the goods while suspending the payment of duties and VAT. There are various options, and this is just one example, but you need to really understand what the timelines are for you, both internally within your company or if you have to perform any administrative obligations. And for that, certainly from a customs perspective, you can actually use the existing rules between third countries and the UK as a model, because it's likely to be quite similar to that in the future. You need to really understand your role and responsibility. So if you're just a haulier carrying goods, you will still have responsibilities in customs terms, for instance. This is obviously not something you've got to do within the EU, but things will change. You need to consider your training needs. If you need to recruit anyone, plan for it, of course, in advance. Not necessarily starting the recruitment now, but at least knowing who you want to recruit, how many and when, and decide whether you will want to outsource any of these activities and responsibilities to third-party logistics providers, because they are likely to get a little bit overloaded. So if you want to use that option, we would advise that you start talking to potential partners and companies as quickly as possible. And then, of course, once there is more clarity and on the basis of your own assessments, you can decide which preferred option you want to implement, inform your staff and partners, and then implement the changes that could be IT related to real estate, your logistics processes and the routes you're using, for instance, or your production. We presented yesterday 2 services that we're launching with some partners. The first one is customs classification service to really help you classify your goods under the UCC codes. This is very important because choosing the right code or not choosing it will mean that you will pay a very, very different price in terms of tariffs, if any, in the future, and it will be an obligation anyway, as a result of leaving the customs union. So we advise that you don't wait until the last moment to do that, and you can of course approach FTA consultancy to do it. Another service we launched is a routing and scheduling service in partnership with PTV. So this is perhaps of greater use to companies that don't have these resources in-house, but it would help you sort of model all the alternative routes and options to reach both the continent and Irish destinations, but also to bring goods from the continent and Ireland to the UK. With ferry and short sea crossings, information on multimodal capability, including road, rail, barge, and air. So this could be quite useful if there are disruptions after Brexit. So last but not least, a bit of a reminder on forthcoming FTA events and activities. If you don't receive it yet, please do register to get the Brexit Digest. It's a weekly newsletter. You can contact me for more information on how to do that. You've got my email address here on the slide. Then, of course, there's the UK Council, FTA UK Council. We're going to have a special session on Brexit there, so I really recommend you attend. If you're a shipper, it's fairly easy. You just need to attend the British Shippers Council. Participation otherwise might be restricted on the basis of whether you're a representative of your regional council or not, but to discuss the options with us. Then, of course, on the 19th of July, we have our next FTA Brexit webinar. And at the beginning of September, a new series of conferences really focused on road transport and international operations between the UK and the continent and the UK and Ireland after Brexit. And we'll have 4 sessions. The one on the 4th of September will take place in Liverpool. The other 2 on the 11th and the 13th of September, it will be either the Midlands or Dartford. So you'll have one in the Midlands, one in Dartford, but we need to finalize the choice of venue. So there will be more information on that and information on the program. But of course, Brexit will be one of the topics that will be discussed at that point. So I don't see any questions at this point. So what I would suggest is if you have any questions and you want to answer them in the system, you can do. If we don't pick them up now, oh, sorry, I see there is one. Wooden pallets be subject to any phytosanitary and sanitary conditions? Yes. So I will have to come back to you with all the details, but essentially, I think they have to be treated or fumigated at the moment in order to be accepted into the EU. So yes, the same thing, same rules would apply than the ones that currently apply between trade with the rest of the world, essentially, for wooden pallets. So yes, this is potentially a very, very big issue. You're right. It could go away if the 2 sides manage to reach an agreement like Switzerland, for instance. But, well, they are quite far apart on where they want to go on this. So unfortunately, at the moment, the most likely option is that these checks would apply in full. So if there are any more questions in the future, we'll pick them up and try to get back to you to answer them. Meanwhile, thank you very much for your attention. Thanks a lot if you attended our conference yesterday. I hope you found it useful. And for any more information, of course, you can consult our website and the social media channels. Thank you very much and have a nice day.